Season 2 of the Fallout TV show is, in my opinion, a complete betrayal of New Vegas and everything it set up. Now, I know I am late to the party, but after watching this season, I couldn't help but throw my hat into the ring as to whether or not the show respected the games. The TV show has seen some generally positive reviews, however I cannot in good conscience give this season a very high rating simply because I feel that as an adaptation of New Vegas, it fails in so many places. And in this video, let's explore that and why the show fails to truly capture the magic that was New Vegas. To illustrate why I believe this, there is a perfect example that exists in the very first episode. It's minor, but I think it displays a lot of the issues we see within the show. In this episode, we are reintroduced to a very familiar place, Novac. But what was once a nice and quaint town for respite has now been abandoned and is instead occupied by the Great Khans of all people. But before I explain why I dislike both Novac's and the Great Khan's portrayals in the show, let's first talk about the art of adaptation. Specifically, let's talk about the disadvantages that the show has compared to the game. When you really think about it, a video game, especially one as open and non-linear as New Vegas, can convey a lot more story information compared to a show. The reason it can is because that information in a video game can be totally optional. The way I see it is, there are two types of information in a video game like New Vegas. There's vital information that's necessary for you to understand the plot, things that explain who you are, what you are doing, and why. However, there is tons of information about each faction, character, and location that is totally optional but still feels natural within the context of the game. You could talk to every member of each faction and get the rundown of exactly who they are, or you could just shoot them in the face. But either way, there is still a lot of lore and background information about these characters and factions. It's just that one player had it told to them and the other simply had it implied. But the mere existence of this information makes these factions incredibly deep and complex. Now, jump to the show where it has to pick and choose what information it shows to the viewer. It can't just have some random person explain everything there is to know about a certain faction. The reason why it works in a video game is because it's totally optional. I don't have to talk to this random NPC. I can continue with the main plot, but if I do, it still feels like a natural way of receiving story information. But in a show, there are no other options. It's limited in how much information it can tell you before it starts to drag down the pace of the show. However, I don't think this is a huge issue, because you can still imply that same level of complexity. You can explain enough to give a basic understanding of who they are, but imply a deeper history beyond what we are presented. However, I feel the show fails at doing this. Instead, I think each faction is either oversimplified without any depth presented in the game, or radically different, leaving you questioning what the hell happened to them. And I really want to just focus on comparing what is presented in the show to how it's presented in New Vegas. And looking back at our example of Novac and the Great Khans, let's take a look at how they are portrayed. Now, the Great Khans are a pretty deep and fleshed out faction in New Vegas. There's a lot of brutal history that contextualizes their appearance in the game very well. But in the show, they are effectively a bunch of raiders. No, literally, you could replace them with a bunch of nameless raiders and they would have the same effect in the show. Now, once again, the show can't provide the same level of depth the game can because it doesn't have time to. But then why use the Great Khans in this scene? By presenting the Great Khans in this extremely simplified way, you've done a huge disservice to what they are like in the game. Why not instead use a different faction that you can characterize uniquely? Or maybe just make them raiders, because that's effectively who they are in the show. Now let's go back to Novac, because Novac shows the second failure in the show, and that's raising too many questions that can't possibly be answered. Why is Novac abandoned? What happened to the residents of Novac? These are questions that will be naturally raised because I play the games. But the issue is, the show doesn't have time to answer these questions, so instead I, as a fan of the game, am left with this sense of ambiguity. I want to know what happened to these people, why Novac is in the state we see it in, but I'm never going to get those answers because, as I said, the show can't stop and answer that question. It has to maintain its pace and keep going. But that doesn't feel good as a fan of the games. If you're going to present a location or a faction but have them be radically different, I'm going to want answers as to why. I understand there is a 15-year difference between the game and the show, but there's a difference between what can be seen as natural change versus drastic change. A natural change would be maybe there are different people. Maybe some of the old people moved out and some new people moved in. What we see in the show is that something happened to the people of Novak. Something caused them to abandon it, and I want to know what that thing is. Now, to be fair, both Novak and the Great Khans are minor things in the context of Fallout as a whole. It would be nice to know what happened in Novak, but I'm not going to lose sleep over not knowing. However, does the show at least get the bigger things from the games right? Well, unfortunately, no. Let's go chronologically with who we see in the show first, and the first major character we see from the game is the big man himself, Mr. House. Now I think that House is the least egregious one out of all the recurring characters and factions from the games. He mostly remains a believable depiction compared to what we see in the game. The pre-war scenes with him are quite interesting, and I do like the actor they chose for him. I think he does a very good job. So everything seems alright, right? Well, there are two problems. One happens at the very end, which we'll get to later, but the other is the very first scene we see of House. In the first scene of the show, we see House egging on some patrons at a bar to attack him. He then uses his mind control device to make one of them beat the others to death before having to explode the last person's head. Now, I don't think mind control is completely unbelievable for House. The problem I have is the manner in which he's using it. He seems to enjoy the violence. This is not the House I know from the game. House New Vegas can be violent, but only when necessary. He even has dialogue where he comments on the courier for being barbaric and basically insults you for it.
Sorry to deny you a moment of primate triumph, but you'll have to go elsewhere to sound your barbaric yawp.
He doesn't enjoy violence, he only sees it as a means to an end. Now, as I said, this is not very egregious and overall is pretty minor. But don't worry, things get much worse from here on out. The Legion is by far one of the most menacing factions in the history of video games. Their introduction to New Vegas with a ravaged Nipton sets the tone that they are not to be messed with. They bring a sense of brutality to the wasteland. However, in the show, they are kind of a joke. Their introduction was well done, but afterwards it slowly devolves into absurdity. So apparently the Legion has fallen into civil war. Now, this doesn't seem completely impossible, in fact it was even hinted at in the games. However, the way it's done is complete and utter bullshit, because apparently the two warring sects of the Legion live right next to each other. In the middle is the corpse of Caesar, who has the true successor written on a piece of paper. This is just stupid. There is no way the Legion has been in this stalemate for this long. Given that Caesar's brain tumor was happening during New Vegas, he couldn't have lived for very long afterwards. This means that this civil war could have lasted anywhere up to 15 years. There is no way this stalemate could have lasted anywhere near that long because, like I said, they live right next to each other. Any threat the Legion could have had is immediately destroyed by this ridiculous situation. And for the final nail in the coffin, when they actually do get to Caesar's body, it reads, "I am Caesar. I am the Legion. It ends with me." This straight up goes against what Caesar wanted in New Vegas. He wanted to create an empire that would last many years. What's the point in doing that if you didn't want it to last after your deaths? Plus, there are so many successors he could have possibly chosen from New Vegas who are for some reason just absent in the show. Like Atlanteus, Vulpes and Colta, hello? And last note about the Legion. Does the show understand how big the Legion was? It spanned across the Colorado River, New Mexico, and Arizona. It was huge. Yet we only see one encampment in the Mojave where they are fighting. Granted, later in the show, they show a large number of Legion soldiers, which is more accurate to how big the Legion should really be. So maybe they do know. However, it's unclear whether or not the Legion still have their foothold in places outside of the Mojave. So once again, it's this lack of knowledge that plagues the show. They can't explain everything there is to know about the Legion, so they simplify it to make it easier to depict, which once again just undermines everything about the faction. But it's nothing, and I mean nothing compared to what it did with the NCR. So the next faction we see is the NCR, but not really because it's just two rangers in the middle of nowhere doing fuck all. Now that begs the question, where is the NCR? Now I thought this was going to be a pertinent issue throughout the season, and it kind of is, but then they suddenly just show up at the end for some Avengers Endgame-like scene. It just feels out of nowhere and doesn't feel satisfying even in the context of the show. We spend the entire season wondering where they are, and then they just randomly show up at the end. But I think a bigger problem with the NCR's portrayal is what the show implies about them. Specifically, I want to take a look at a line of dialogue Lucy says regarding them in episode 7.
I think I do understand. One side is murdering people, enslaving them, crucifying them, and the other side is just vaguely problematic.
Now the issue is the show seems to regard the NCR as the good guys and the Legion as the bad guys, but that wasn't necessarily the case at all. Now I'm going to say this is partially to do with the game's portrayal of the Legion. They are so morally reprehensible, you can't in good faith argue that they are a better choice than the NCR. And it shows since both Yes Man and House aren't players in this game anymore, the NCR seems to be the best choice to portray as good guys. However, the problem arises when you frame them as only being vaguely problematic, because that was not at all what the game portrayed. The NCR was messy, corrupt, and at times very morally questionable. They are not the goody little two-shoes that the show portrays. Now granted, the show can't really show them being more nuanced because I'm not even sure if the show knows that they still exist half the time. But still, the implication that they are completely righteous is not exactly how the game portrays them. However, let's talk about the elephant in the room. Let's talk about New Vegas itself, and unfortunately, I think the portrayal of New Vegas and mainly the Strip is a complete head scratcher. When we first get to the outskirts of New Vegas, we see the Kings, who are now a bunch of ghouls. Once again, the same things as before. Why are they ghouls? What happened to the rest of the Kings? What about the King himself? What happened to him? No idea, but moving on. Actually, before I move on, I must clarify that after rewatching this section, it's pretty obvious that the final king Lucy shoots is dressed like the king. So that answers my last question. I don't know how I missed that the first time, but whatever. But still, the rest of the questions remain valid. You've drastically changed this group of people from the game, but I have not explained why they are so drastically changed. Anyway, we can move on now. When we actually get into the script, we find it completely abandoned and overrun with death claws. I have no words for this. One of the coolest parts of New Vegas was that amidst this complete wasteland, there was this shining beacon of old world civilization, a place untouched by the bombs and occupied by people who run it like the bombs never dropped. But instead of portraying that, you just make it overrun with death claws? That's just dumb and a complete missed opportunity to portray such a vibrant, unique locale in live action. You have the budget to do it. They even portrayed pre-war New Vegas, so post-war New Vegas should absolutely be possible. But thankfully, we get an explanation, but it's just not very good. So this bartender tells us that apparently the death claws from Quarry Junction just moved up into the Strip. Excuse me, but how can they get into the Strip but leave Freeside perfectly intact? That makes zero sense. If you look at a map of New Vegas, there is no way to get into the Strip without going through Freeside. Unless you take the monorail, which I'm not sure if death claws can do. To be fair, later they explained that it was actually the Enclave who orchestrated the death claws arrival into the Strip, but my question would be, how do you feasibly do that without being seen? Like, they can't just spawn them in if they're the same ones from Quarry Junction. Like, they don't have instant transmission. But anyway, I understand the reason for doing this. It's to give our heroes obstacles between them and their goal. But you can still do that with an intact New Vegas. Like, maybe have them ask around and New Vegas' shady characters can make things hard on them. Or maybe Cooper has a bounty on his head and he has to avoid being caught. There are tons of possibilities with a bustling New Vegas that was just wasted. But Freeside, on the other hand, is fine, I guess. It's cool seeing it more populated and bustling than what was shown in the games. It's kind of how I would imagine Freeside would have looked if Obsidian had more budget to make Freeside more lively. My only minor gripe, and this applies to the show overall, is that we really don't see many returning characters in the show. I know it's been 15 years, but still, it would be cool to see at least someone we know from the games besides just Mr. House. Like even the bartender for the Atomic Wrangler. Why not make it the Garrett twins? It's very minor, but just something I feel like mentioning before I move on. But I think we should tackle the biggest thing that relates to both New Vegas and the Fallout universe as a whole. It's a part of the game that is debated heavily and is a reason why the game has such a strong legacy. And that is the ending to New Vegas. Specifically, which ending from the game is canon? And the answer is... we don't know. They wanted to go with this fog of war approach to canonizing an ending, but I strongly disagree with this approach. Some people would argue canonizing an ending removes the sandbox nature of the game's multiple choices, which I can kind of see where they're coming from, but at the same time, it doesn't make it so that you can't do the other endings in the game. But others may argue that canonizing an ending to New Vegas would undermine the discussion around it. But I don't think it does. Instead, it might even fuel it even more. Because canonizing one ending does not nullify the existence of the others. Instead, it gives us more context into one ending, allowing us more information about the future. It may instead revitalize discussions around the ending, as we now have a concrete answer to what one looks like, but only one. We still can discuss the others in relation to the canon ending we've seen in the show, but instead we are just left in the dark and have no idea what the hell happened at Hoover Dam. The reason I hate this so much is that it just makes New Vegas seem utterly pointless. In 15 years, basically nothing that happened in the game matters very much, and the entire game feels frankly kind of meaningless. Yes, we get to decide who rules New Vegas by the end of the game, the same New Vegas that will just be overrun by Death Claws in 15 years. It robs the game's plot of importance. Why isn't anything that happened in Hoover Dam even mentioned? In the game it was hyped up to be this huge moment, but in the show there's just nothing about it. What was even the point? But here's the thing, by simply having the setting be in New Vegas, you have to make some decisions about what is canon and what is not. And by doing so, you inadvertently have to canonize some events that happened in New Vegas. So instead of preserving that sandbox nature, you've not only taken it away by canonizing some events that have to happen, but you also make it ambiguous, leaving everyone just confused. It's the worst of both worlds. But okay, let's just take a moment and see if we can decipher what the canon ending may be, shall we? At the end of the season, we see House with the no signal screen. However, Cooper puts the cold fusion thingy into the little machine, and voila, he's back alive.
I will say this much, it's good to be alive again.
Now this line is very important, as he says it's good to be alive again, which would imply he was not alive at some point, or in other words, he died. Essentially, the leading theory is that the cold fusion created an AI version of House that we see in the show, and that House at this point is dead. Which I'm not too sure how I feel about that, but whatever. But you see how in this way you've already made one of the endings not canon? I don't see any universe where House is still alive. For one, why does his screen say no signal? If the courier sided with House in New Vegas, then there is no reason for him to be disconnected at this point in time. Second, there is no way in hell he would ever let New Vegas just be overrun with Death Claws. There are just so many things wrong with House being alive, especially since in every other ending you have to kill him. However, if that is the case, then why isn't Yes Man in the mainframe? We see a Securitron next to House's screen, so that might have been Yes Man, but if so, why isn't he the one we see on the screen? Unless something substantial happened in between the show and the game, the Yes Man ending seems unlikely. So now that leaves us with two endings. However, the NCR has barely any power in the Mojave at this point, so it's unlikely to be them, and the Legion just seems to be an unlikely pick. Or maybe, because in episode 8, the Legate says something very peculiar.
Together, we will reclaim the Holy Land that they call Vegas.
Did you catch it? He said they would reclaim New Vegas. Now, to reclaim something would imply that you had it at some point in time. So, did the courier side with the Legion after all? But there's also the fact that in episode 3 we see a Mark II Securitron, which would imply that the courier installed the Platinum chip. Now, why would the courier do that if he was going to side with the Legion? Okay, you know what? With all this information, I think there is one conclusion we can come to. The courier must have been a bumbling fucking idiot. Now, despite everything I've said, I'm not going to accuse the creators of the show of actively trying to destroy New Vegas because Todd hates it and yada yada yada. But I'm also not going to accuse them of being negligent and having never played the games, because in reality, I don't know if either is true. In fact, I think the contrary. From what I've seen in the show, it seems to me that they definitely at least played the games. However, I think a lot of the problems from the show arise because they had a fundamental misunderstanding of the game. And I think this one line from episode 5 exemplifies that misunderstanding.
Guess you saw them Death Claw things come up from Quarry Junction. they farting around the strip. Big whoop. Just another fucking round of changing management, that's all it is. Like one of the merry-go-rounds. NCR Legion, NCR Legion. Fucking robots. No matter to me. Always somebody trying to tell us what to do.
Now, there are two things wrong with this quote. One is that the show takes place only 15 years after New Vegas. There can't be that many shifts in power because there just isn't enough time for there to be. However, the more pressing issue is the fact that this line directly goes against what New Vegas and Fallout as a whole are trying to say. Fallout's themes are deeply ingrained with war, there is no question about it. However, while war never changes, war still has consequences. There are consequences if the Legion wins the Battle of Hoover Dam, and the same if the NCR, House, or Yes Man wins. Depending on who wins, the lives of everyone in the Mojave are deeply affected and changed in very different ways. This is why the main plot in New Vegas feels so impactful. It's because it is. You get to decide how the future of the Mojave is shaped based on the consequences of the war at hand. Hell, the entire Fallout universe's existence is based on the consequences of the Great War. But this line in the show implies that war is basically meaningless. The shifts in power don't have much of an effect on the people of the Mojave, when that simply shouldn't be the case. In fact, I would argue it's antithetical to what the game is trying to say. Now, some would argue that Bethesda has had this misunderstanding of Fallout all the way back with Fallout 3, but that's a topic to explore for another video. Ultimately, I think the show completely undermines Fallout New Vegas' place within the Fallout universe. All the way back when Season 1 dropped, I made a video titled, "Will Fallout Season 2 Ruin New Vegas?" And looking back, I got a lot wrong in that video. But the title was somewhat of a hyperbole, because no matter what the second season did, New Vegas will still exist. It doesn't just erase it out of existence, and the game can still be enjoyed for what it is. However, if we consider New Vegas holistically in tandem with the show, then yeah, it kinda does ruin it, or at the very least makes it less impactful. On its own, Fallout Season 2 is a fine show, although I would argue Season 1 was much better. However, when we consider it within the context of New Vegas, it feels like a slap in the face for fans of the game. In short, as a fan of New Vegas, I unfortunately did not enjoy Season 2, and I believe it did not do the games justice at all. But that's just what I think. What about you guys? What do you think about Fallout Season 2? Let me know in the comments below, and if you like this video then please like, subscribe, hit the bell, and I will catch you another time.